Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. If you see the writer is Sam Roberts, you know you're going to learn something wonderful about New York City. As the urban affairs correspondent at the New York Times, the host of New York Times Close-Up, as well as the author or editor of 8 books, he never disappoints with his stories and facts. His newest contribution is A History of New York in 101 Objects. And he's my guest today. Welcome.
Thank you, Ronnie.
So tell me about this book.
Well, it started off when the British Museum and the BBC did a history of the world in 100 objects, and clearly you couldn't fit New York in merely 100, so the conceit of this book is it took 101 for New York. And it started off as a story for the New York Times. We did 50 in the paper, which is really all we could fit, and then asked readers to contribute their suggestions. And we got about 1,000 people just writing in with great suggestions, great ideas of all the things I left out. So we added another 15 in a subsequent article, and it was clear that there was enough material here for a book. Simon & Schuster thought it was a great idea, and here is the book, A History of New York in 101 Objects. It was the most fun I've ever had doing a book.
And now the Smithsonian is out with 1,000 or something.
Well, they're out with the history of the world in 1,000, and it's not as if 900 transformative objects suddenly materialized. It's just that this has become a cottage industry, a great way of selling history, and has become the lingua franca, if you will, of historical exploration.
Well, you've gone through the book, and you start very early, prehistoric, I guess, right? And we work our way through. I'm having a little difficulty because I'm quite imaginative, but I can't figure out some objects that you've missed, or even why. So an object in history it's not supposed to be nostalgic, right?
Well, that's...
I mean, what's the difference?
First of all, the objects are listed more or less chronologically. And I did have certain criteria. And you have to remember the book is very, very subjective. It is not the list of 101 objects. It is not even a list. It's my list. And anyone can sit down and come up with his or her own list for sure. But there were certain criteria that I began with. I wanted objects that were transformational in the city's history.
Which means?
They really affected change, or were emblematic of some sort of change. Objects that existed. There was only one object in the book that doesn't exist, or at least I couldn't find it.
What was that? Which
that
one?
was Bobby Thompson's home run baseball in 1951.
That's the great mystery.
The great mystery. If it exists, I couldn't find it.
But that in itself is something. That's why it was
there. That made it even more fascinating. They couldn't be too much bigger than a bread box, so not the Statue of Liberty, not the Empire State Building. They couldn't be human. A number of people suggested Ed Koch. We had to rule that out. They couldn't all be about food. It was amazing the number of suggestions, and here you have some of the best examples. These were included. Bagels, of course, very much a New York institution. People suggested pizza, chow mein, egg foo young, every other variety, and of course black and white cookies. I exercised author's prerogative and picked those because I happen to like black and white cookies. But after a point, I realized that given declining crime in the city, perhaps the city's motto should become leave the gun, take the cannoli, because everything seemed to be about food. And I wanted things that really would, as you say, not just be governed by nostalgia, that would be enduring, that would not just be things that we feel strongly about now, but would be important 50 or 100 years from now. The Smithsonian did a survey of the most iconic object in its collection over this past summer. 90,000 people voted. And what they voted for, number one, a panda that was born last year. Now, is that going to be important 50 or 100 years ago? That was over the Star-Spangled Banner that flew at Fort McHenry.
You know, that's really depressing.
A Gilbert Stewart painting.
Was that depressing to you?
It was depressing. I mean, pandas are cuddly as anything, but I don't think it's going to be considered transcendental 50 or 100 years from now.
It would have been if you did something with Nixon visiting China, maybe.
That
right?
perhaps, yes. Yeah. And that's what I was looking for, those quirky kind of things.
Things that really changed the course.
Or that made you think about history in a different, provocative way. Because the idea was to have fun with this book.
Well, it should be a game. I mean, it is fun. It's going to be now a lot of people are going to do it, obviously, don't you think?
Well, I say let the parlor game
Kids,
begin.
yeah,
And one of the things
absolutely.
we do in the book is put a email address, because I want people to submit more suggestions, because I don't have the monopoly on them by any means. I think there are a lot more out there, and maybe there'll be a volume 2.
Yeah, I was the object is an object itself has its own history, right? But an object that affects history is a different story, right?
Well, that's
Yes.
right. So you have something like
The cotton pick. The cotton.
one of my favorites, exactly, the mechanical cotton picker. Why is that in a book of 101 New York objects? You could go all through this giant city and probably never find a mechanical cotton picker. But when the mechanical cotton picker began being manufactured in mass production in the late 1940s, that changed New York, because it freed blacks from being bound to the land in the South, in Texas, in Alabama and Louisiana, and it created a demographic upheaval that shifted them to northern cities like New York and changed the face, if you will, changed the complexion of New York. So even though there's not a mechanical cotton picker in New York, that changed the face of New York.
Could we include a pogrom in Eastern Europe?
Well, if you could make an object for a pogrom, I was thinking of the gun that assassinated Tsar Alexander as an object that created the pogroms in the late 1880s in Russia. That is certainly a candidate for an object. If you could find that gun or some representation of it, absolutely.
Now, a telephone booth. I was trying to figure out. The telephone booth on the corner, which we don't have anymore. I mean, is that affected the communication? Because people used to be at home with a telephone that shared the operator with other people. Then the next thing was you got your own telephone. Then people wanted to be able to use the telephone outside of the home, so you got a telephone booth. And now everybody carries the telephone with them. How does that fit into it?
Well, it could have. I wanted things, though, that were not too generic, things that were more unique to New York. So we have the Atlantic Cable, which connected New York to Europe and solidified the city's position in international trade and commerce. One of the first messages that came from Europe was that a war, I forget which one it was over in Europe, and that affected the stock market. And that really solidified the city's position as a center of commerce for the United States and for the world. So it was a particular New York institution, whereas one could argue that phones played a role all over the country.
All over the world.
So, I mean, it was a touch and go thing. It was a very, again, as I say, subjective thing. And again, I was looking for the quirky sort of stuff. One of my favorites, which you may bring up, and I don't want to preempt you, is the artichoke. I mean, what is an artichoke doing in a book about objects of New York? Well, it was emblematic of organized crime. If people think they're living under a nanny state with Rudy Giuliani or Michael Bloomberg, Mayor LaGuardia, to stop the spread of organized crime, banned the sale of artichokes because Ciro Terranova was the artichoke king. He controlled the entire market of artichokes. And LaGuardia said, if we ban the sale of artichokes entirely, then we will eliminate organized crime. Well, that worked about as well as banning the sale of big soft drinks.
So sorry that you left out.
Oh, lots of things.
Yeah.
Really, the hardest thing was not finding 101. The hardest thing was winnowing it down to 101. Bella Abzug's hat, one representation of that, and the women's movement. A pigeon. I thought that was too generic, not New York enough. The inflatable rat that is shown up at non-union work sites. That appealed to me for any number of reasons, sort of the air going out of organized labor. Things like that. There were lots of things that were left out and that people keep suggesting, that email address, objectsofnyc at gmail.com, people can still write them in if they want. But so many things that I had to leave out for one reason or another. They became duplicative, they became too representative of one era or not. As you said, I wanted to be representative of more than 400 years, so that first object goes back 1.2 billion, a rock formation in the Bronx that is probably the oldest rock formation in the city, and the most recent, a Madonna that was in Breezy Point, Queens, that survived both Superstorm Sandy and the fire at Breezy Point, that from 2012.
Now, you never would have been captivated, I don't think, by this if you didn't have the love of the city that you have and the interest in its history and the little quirky stories that you find. I mean, I don't think there's anybody else around that writes the way you do about the city.
Well, I don't know about that, but I do love the city. I was born in Brooklyn, grew up in the city, only left to go to college somewhat reluctantly, and it just fascinates me. I mean, I've had the opportunity to go cover places all over the world for the Daily News, for the New York Times, and have never run out of things to cover in New York. It's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing. There's no shortage of characters here. And one of the things I love to do, and frankly don't get to do enough of, is get on a subway train and get off at a stop either I've never been to or haven't been to in a long time. And it's always a voyage of discovery. You find new things that you've never seen before.
It is a changing city, and you document it with figures because you've become our reader of the census and interpreter to us to tell us what's happening here.
Well, it's getting
Major
bigger and more
changes,
diverse than ever before.
Yeah. How many more people do you know?
Well, it's past 8.4 million, which is the biggest it's ever been in its history. It's projected by the next census in 2020, it will probably be close to 9 million if immigration keeps going up. And immigration is and always has been the lifeblood of this city. When people complain about, well, look at all the signs in a foreign language or something like that, go back at the old black and white pictures. Yeah. It's always been that way. And always, you know, whoever comes more recently is sort of kicking the door closed behind them. That's the way we've always been.
The immigration, though, the pattern has changed substantially. No longer European countries or Eastern European, right? That's made a major change in the city.
That's true. It is more from Latin and South America. It is more from Asia. And it is more diverse within those continents, for sure. And I think that's one of the joys. You can't stereotype people as much. When you look at blacks, for instance, we thought of blacks coming primarily from the South. Well, then there was this giant influx from the Caribbean, and now there is a small number, but a growing number from Africa.
And people also, at the same time they're coming in, some of them are going back, but more are coming in.
That's right. There are more coming in, and actually there are more coming in from elsewhere in the United States. There is a net increase in domestic migration, which is something new.
How many people we have people moving to the city?
We do. Part of that was the recession, that it was harder to sell your home and move out. There was less incentive to move somewhere else because the jobs weren't there, but there was a net increase for the first time in a long time in domestic migration.
Do we know where they came from? How old they were?
Everywhere. They came from California, they came from the Midwest, some of them came from Florida, returnees, people who were the old, as they call them, who came back to live near their families, who found the medical care was better here, who found New York City was a better place to retire because the transportation was better, it was easier to order in, it was easier to be a retiree in New York, Manhattan, than it was down south. A lot of advantages to being in New York than other places in the country.
That's something that, for the history book about ordering out.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
that's changed life.
The air conditioner is one of the objects in this book because not only did it make the building of skyscrapers and movie theaters and department stores easier, but it also created a demographic movement. It made the Sun Belt more bearable and created that outflow of people to the Sun Belt, which not only was a demographic flow, but a political flow that reduced New York's political power in Congress and the ability to elect a president.
So interesting. And when you get old enough, I don't know if you're old enough to have been there before.
Then you're so sweet.
I know. But I remember no air conditioning. I worked at CBS in those days. 1 o'clock, if the temperature reached something, everybody went home.
That's right. And
Right.
city employees got home if the temperature reached a certain level in the summer.
And then the movies were air-cooled, not
Air-cooled,
air-conditioned.
that's right.
And the refrigerators really had ice in them
And
back in the old days.
A man named Carrier who started at a printing plant in Williamsburg, Brooklyn.
Isn't that amazing?
Yep.
Gosh,
So much of these things started in New York that people forget. There's a ticket, one of the objects that is my favorite, a ticket to the 3rd Avenue Trolley. A black woman named Elizabeth Jennings gets on the 3rd Avenue Trolley to go to church services where she played the organ on a Sunday morning, gets kicked off the trolley because she is black. She sues. She hires a young lawyer named Chester Arthur, who will go on to become president of the United States, and she wins her civil rights case against the 3rd Avenue Trolley 100 years before Rosa Parks. The ticket to the 3rd Avenue Trolley is one of the objects in the book.
That's an amazing thing to have sued then. I mean, we didn't have a Commission on Human Rights. We didn't have anything about equal rights. So it was Arthur smarter than we're taught to believe?
He must have been smarter
Must have been.
as a lawyer than a president, and he must have had a good Brooklyn judge that he went before who said, if this woman behaves, if she minds her manners, there is no legal right to throw her off the trolley just because she is black.
It's amazing. So what part of New York, when you get off the subway, do you think has changed the most? Is that a possible question?
Well, one of the neighborhoods that is changing the most, and what's so remarkable is that so much is changing. Obviously, the neighborhoods in Brooklyn now, you go to Bedford-Stuyvesant, you go even to East New York, but the South Bronx is changing remarkably.
And that's in the book.
That's in the book too. I mean, you look at Charlotte Street and you look at the housing prices on Charlotte Street, those ranch houses that were built, probably not the most efficient use of land, certainly to have, plots of ranch houses. But you look at the prices of some of those houses now, and when they were built, people thought it was a fantasy land to be building those houses in the South Bronx. And it is a remarkable comeback story.
It's raised a red flag in my mind as a former public official or something. And I don't want to deny people more money, especially in this housing market. But if you bought one of those houses, how much were they originally sold for?
Well, they were subsidized. They were sold in the tens of thousands of dollars,
So
and
they
now
were
they're in the
subsidized,
hundreds.
and now you can sell it for a couple of $100,000?
Yep.
And you keep the money. Is that fair? Is
Well,
that good government? I don't know.
It may not be good government, but it's good commerce.
It certainly is, and it helps. So what else? Where else in the city?
Well,
In the housing part, this is a danger, though, for the city, isn't it?
Well, it's a danger because you wonder where all the poor people
Right,
are going.
right.
There's no question about that. And it is a gentrifying city. When you look at it statistically, that is certainly true. Some of those poor people who own property, who have lived in that property for a long time, are making money or staying put. But the ones who are being pushed out are not. And when you look at the mayor's commitment to affordable housing, which is commendable, how do we define affordable housing? It means people who are making up to $140,000 a year. That's a lot of money. I mean, you explain to anyone elsewhere in the country that that's affordable, that's a tough sell.
It is a very hard sell. So the income of people in New York, has that risen?
The income has risen very slowly, according to the latest American Community Survey, which just came out in September. It is not back at pre-recession levels. And the poverty rate is still stubbornly at 1/5 of the population. And the number of people who are hungry or collecting food stamps is still outrageously high by any standard.
And it reflects the disparity of income? How about millionaires?
Yeah, the inequality is the rich are getting richer and the poor are, if not getting poorer, certainly are not getting any better off.
So now a slightly political question. The suggestion that you put a tax on luxury apartments that are not for full-time residents, that sounds like a legitimate idea, doesn't it?
Well, I'd like to know from an economist whether that works or not, but it is kind of outrageous that so many apartments are dark at night. I don't think that's healthy socially for the city. When you find so many luxury buildings going up and there's nobody in them, because people buy them as pied-à-terres, buy them as investments, and you see whole neighborhoods that are sort of unoccupied. I don't think that's healthy, because one of the great things about New York, and particularly about neighborhoods of Manhattan, is they're full of people. And you go to lots of other cities in the country that are like ghost towns at night. And I don't think that would be good to happen in New York. And if we can make money out of that without discouraging the construction, I think that would be a very healthy thing. If somebody could, compute the mathematics of that and find out that it really wouldn't discourage the construction.
Are there figures of people who are worth millions or billions and buying such high-priced things, of how many of them are residents of the country?
There must be, and I don't know what they are. I think you can find the anecdotal cases, absolutely, of people who say the estate taxes, the other taxes, I'm moving to Florida. There's no question that some people do that. I would say most of those cases, though, at least in my experience, are much more anecdotal than they are statistical.
But there are anecdotal things, stories, whatever we call them, of people from Russia, South America, Asia, who buy apartments, luxury apartments here, cash, and don't pay taxes because they're not residents.
That's true. That is true.
Does that show up in any figures?
I think it can. I think there are ways of tracking that.
So how did you become so interested in all this? Were your parents interested?
Well, they were. They taught me a lot about New York. My dad took me all over the city when I was a kid. We went everywhere in the city so my mother could sleep on a Saturday morning. And I just fell in love with the city.
And how old were you when you first started traveling by yourself?
Oh, I guess in probably late elementary or junior high school.
Did you go exploring then?
Exploring by subway. That was the only way to get around.
Yeah.
It was the best way to get around. And I still ride in the front car of the subway so I can look out and see the tracks. I
remember going down to Penn Station and walking all around in Grand Central, which incidentally, your book about Grand Central Station is wonderful.
Thank you.
And people should buy that and read it. It's just an incredible testament to such a monument. But do people do that now?
I think they do. You see a lot of people walking around the city, and you see the Municipal Arts Society and other groups sponsoring tours, and not just out-of-towners. I think there is a renewed interest in history in this city. Ken Jackson, the Columbia history professor, likes to say history is for losers. Well, he's being facetious. He says, look at Plymouth, Mass, or Jamestown. Those are places that sort of sank into the mud, so all they have to do is wallow in their history. New Yorkers seize upon the present or look to capitalize on the future, so we don't really have time for our history. But New York is a very, very historical place. And I don't think we can really understand who we are or where we're going unless we have a better understanding of where we came from. And that's one of the things I'm trying to get people to do with this book, to look at history in a different way and to look at objects as one way of doing that, to look at objects as one way of measuring authenticity, that it's not just things that cost $1 zillion because someone pays a high price for them, or that they're part of a timeline, a frame of reference in a movie, that things happen chronologically. Someone had to invent things, someone had to create things, and why were they created? What role did they play? So objects, I think, play a very special role and talk to our ingenuity, and they allow us to touch the past. You
also connected also to history, I mean, not just for an object, but like the difference between the British and the Dutch.
Yeah, one of the things in the book is a English-Dutch dictionary. It's sort of our Rosetta Stone. This is 1670, right after the English took over from the Dutch, and they kept many of the Dutch customs because why, fool with something that's working? And what they needed was a common language. So this dictionary allowed them to talk to each other. And what distinguished New York from so many other colonies around the country, the Spanish, the French, even the Portuguese, the Swedish, was the Dutch did not come here to escape religious persecution. They didn't come here to proselytize. They came here to make money. And for the most part, if you didn't get in their way of making money, you were okay. There was, for the most part, religious freedom. Now, was that tolerance or was that indifference? You can argue that point forever, but we exported that tolerance to the rest of the country, and that tolerance became a symbol of America to the rest of the world. And that was all because of our Dutch roots, which made us distinct from the rest of America.
I think in fairness to the Dutch, they're known as being a tolerable population and country.
I think so. Peter Stuyvesant wasn't, but I think the Dutch and the Dutch West India Company was.
Yeah. And then during the Second World War and all of that,
No.
I mean, they've always had that. I think they've philosophically been very proud of that tradition. But do you have a...
And the very name cookie is from the Dutch.
Is that right?
Yes, not necessarily black and white cookie, which you can argue is a symbol of diversity as well, but the cookie is.
I remember the first time I went to Holland, the Netherlands, I was really surprised at how much of the language I could understand.
Well, cookie, stoop,
Yeah.
lots of other words, and of course Brooklyn.
And the stoop brings us up to the ball.
Yes, the Spalding, as we in New York call it, which is in the book and very much a New York institution. I don't think it was, maybe is now, called the Spalding anywhere else in the country. And now it is even called the Spalding by the Spalding Company. And you can still buy them, or buy them again. They went out of production, and here they are again.
So the scholar of history and geography and demographics, it all shows up in this book.
I hope so.
But it also shows up when you write in the newspaper. They're always a source of your articles, of learning something new, and of maybe a little laugh, because you do like that whimsy, don't you?
I do. I have to make myself laugh a little bit too. And it's fun. I mean, that's what makes writing for the paper and, you know, writing books so much fun, and this one in particular.
So what's the next book?
The next book is a book that was inspired by Graham Robb, who wrote a book called Parisians. And it was a history of Paris told through a bunch of relatively obscure individuals. And I'm trying to do the same thing now about New York.
Well, that's great, and we're looking forward to it. And thank you so much, Sam Roberts.
Thank you, Ronnie.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.